Hi, my name is Matthew Barnett, and this is my educational psychology pioneer presentation. I've chosen to do my presentation over Edward Thorndike. The theories that he's most connected with are connectionism, the law of effect, law of exercise, the law of readiness, the transfer of training theory, and the educational psychology framework. Edward Thorndike had many contributions to the field of educational psychology. To start, we'll go over some of these, which are kind of the bigger ones. He's sometimes referred to as the founder of modern educational psychology, as a lot of what he did laid the framework or the groundwork of what was built upon later. His work on animal behavior and the learning process is what led to his theory of connectionism. His theory of connectionism states that behavioral responses to specific stimuli are established through a process of trial and error that affects neural connections between the stimuli and the most satisfying response. The law of effect states that behaviors following positive consequences are more likely to reoccur. Dissatisfaction or discomfort means they are less likely to occur. In other words, a positive feedback or positive consequence is going to lead to doing that behavior more, whereas a negative consequence or negative response is going to lead to that being less likely to occur. This contributed to the reinforcement theory and behavior analysis. It still has a great impact on the classroom today. A study in 2002 ranked Thorndike as the 9th most cited psychologist of the 20th century, meaning his work was very relevant and is still cited today. Thorndike placed a heavy emphasis on measurements and quantitative analysis rather than just descriptive accounts of experiments. This was something that was outside of the norm for his day and time, and he was one of the pioneers in this field that actually used the scientific process to record data in this field. He applied scientific methods to education, which was a new thing for education. He contributed to solving industrial problems like employee exams and testing. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And he helped lay the scientific foundation for educational psychology as a whole. To go into his biographical information a little bit, he was born August 31st in 1874 in Williamsburg, Massachusetts, to Edward R. and Abby B. Thorndike. His early childhood was spent with his two brothers, Lynn and Ashley, who also went on to become important scholars. They were raised well in the home and were well educated. He graduated from the Roxbury Latin School in 1891 and was regarded as a successful student. He was always interested in how animals learn, or ethology, which led to a lot of the overlap in his research and theories later on. Even from the age of a child, he was very interested in animals and loved cats, which is what led to a lot of his experiments being done with animals. Moving on to the early stages of his life and his career. Early on, he was not very interested in psychology, but after reading the book, The Principles of Psychology by William James, his interest began to grow. He actually graduated with his bachelor's degree from Wesleyan University in 1895 and then enrolled at Harvard for English and French literature. While he was there, he took a psychology course that was taught by William James and refocused his studies to psychology rather than English and French literature. He earned his Master of Arts from Harvard and eventually transferred schools to Columbia, where he learned from James McKean Cattell. When he gave his doctoral dissertation is when he introduced his law of effect for the first time. He went on to graduate with his PhD from Columbia in 1898, and he then took a job as an assistant professor of pedagogy at Case Western Reserve University for Women. He was not very content with this job, which again we'll talk about later, and he soon moved on to something else. In 1900, he married Elizabeth Moulton, and they ended up having 5 children in total together. After he worked as a psychology professor at the Teachers College at Columbia University, where he taught for the remainder of his career. Moving into his accomplishments during his career as an educational psychologist, he was one of the early psychologists who introduced the law of effect and became known as the founder of modern educational psychology. He was one of the ones in the beginning who began to apply the scientific research methods into education, which was very new at this time. He began to dive deep into psychology when he read a book that interested him in this realm, and this is what sparked all of his evidence and research in this field. He graduated with his PhD from Columbia University. This was completed under the supervision of James McKean Cattell, who was one of the founding fathers of psychometrics. His big claim to fame is that he was one of the founders of educational psychology and an early pioneer of behavioral learning theory. After briefly working at the College for Women of Case Western Reserve, where he was unhappy with his job there, he became an instructor in psychology at Teachers College at Columbia University. This is where he remained for the rest of his professional career until he retired. Early in his career, he purchased a wide tract of land on the Hudson and encouraged other researchers to settle around him. This led to a colony of researchers forming around him, with him functioning as its tribal chief in a sense. This led to a lot of research and work together with the people that moved into this area around him. He's best known for the law of effect, where it states that behaviors followed by satisfying outcomes are more likely to be repeated, while those with discomfort are less likely to occur. And this is a principle that's still taught, or a law that's still taught today. He also developed the theory of connectionism through his experiments with his cats. He would place them in a box and allow them to try to find their way out. He did not get to finish all of his experiments on this that he wanted to, but it did explain learning as the formation of stimulus and response connections. His emphasis, again, on measuring learning outcomes and applying scientific principles helped shape today's evidence-based approaches to instruction and assessment. This still influences the classroom today, and while we have such an emphasis on evidence-based practices. There are believed to have been many psychologists who influenced his work, but to name a few, William James is one of them. Thorndike studied under him at Harvard and actually inspired him to use the scientific methods to study learning and behavior. This is where Thorndike kind of got these scientific principles from and the reason why he began to incorporate them into his work. Ivan Pavlov is another one who influenced him. Pavlov's research on classical conditioning in animals paralleled Thorndike's studies. Both pioneers emphasized how behavior is shaped by associations between stimuli and responses. While their theories may have been a little bit different, some of them were similar, and they both used animals in their research and used that to evidence. Herbert Spencer is another one. He was a philosopher who applied evolutionary theory to psychology and to education. His ideas about adaptation and survival of the fittest influenced Thorndike's connectionism theory. Finally, Charles Darwin was another one who influenced his work. Darwin's theory of evolution deeply shaped early psychology. Thorndike's interest in animal intelligence and comparative psychology was influenced heavily by Darwin. He viewed learning as a natural adaptive process. Getting into his later years, again, I mentioned he worked as a psychology professor at the Teachers College at Columbia for the majority of his career, all except the first year or so. Later into his career, he focused on the study of adult learning. He actually worked for the U.S. Army during World War I and participated in the development of the ARMA beta test. This helped the standard test that the Army would use when testing recruits and soldiers. He actually wrote The Psychology of Wants, Interests, and Attitudes in 1935. He also wrote The Human Nature and the Social Order in 1940. Both of these had to do more with adults than they did with the education of children or in school. He passed away August 9th in 1949. Now on to why his work is relevant today. Thorndike's emphasis on measuring learning outcomes and applying scientific principles helped shape today's evidence-based approaches for instruction and assessment. This greatly influenced modern teaching practices and the importance of measurable outcomes. Thorndike's law of effect laid the foundations for positive reinforcement, which is used across classrooms today by teachers. His emphasis on practice, repetition, and readiness to learn also guide educators on how to design lessons, scaffold instruction, and assess student progress. Finally, his work helped to move education toward a scientific and systematic approach to teaching and learning. Here's my bibliography for this presentation and the research I've done on Edward Thorndike. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation and have learned something from it.